Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button? If you enjoy our content, take a second to subscribe. It's free and it really helps us keep bringing you great stories every day. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 41 years old, a project manager by trade, and I've always considered myself a steady man. Predictable even. I grew up in Minnesota where winters are long, words are measured, and people build lives like brick walls, carefully, layer by layer. My life was one of quiet discipline. I never chased thrills or danger. I believed in love and loyalty and building a future on trust. For 15 years, I believed I was doing just that with my wife, Lydia. Lydia had always been the spark to my calm. Where I was rational, she was spontaneous. Where I found joy in routine, she saw magic in the unknown. I fell for her lightness, her laugh, the way she danced barefoot on our deck in the middle of summer. She was the kind of woman who could make a Tuesday night feel like a festival. For a long time, I thought we balanced each other perfectly, but somewhere along the way, something shifted. It started with a retreat she went on, one of those spiritual awakenings out in the desert. She came back sun-kissed, glowing, and somehow distant. She talked about energy alignments, sacred femininity, and freeing oneself from outdated paradigms of ownership. At first, I listened. I wanted to understand. I wanted to support her growth. I thought maybe this was just a phase, a new lens she was trying on, before settling back into the life we built. But it wasn't a phase. It was a crack. And like any crack, it began to spread. She started spending time with new people, friends from her retreats, people who dressed like drifters but spoke with unsettling confidence, weaving philosophies out of half-read books and borrowed mantras. They called themselves awakened, and they encouraged each other to reject domestication. Lydia took their words to heart. She'd come home from these gatherings and look at me like I was a relic. Safe, predictable, anchored in a system she no longer believed in. One evening just after dinner, she looked at me with a softness that I knew meant something sharp was coming. "Nathan," she said, placing her hand over mine, "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to love freely, to honor our souls rather than contracts." I didn't say anything. I just watched her. My instincts stirred. "I think it's time we opened our marriage," she continued. "Not because I don't love you, but because I want to experience other connections. With honesty, with freedom. I think it would make us stronger." The silence that followed was dense. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her or plead. I simply nodded and told her I needed some time to think. She seemed almost disappointed that I didn't argue, like she had prepared herself for resistance but was left holding a sword with no battle. That night, I'd lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing, so calm, so content in the chaos she had just introduced. I realized I'd already lost her. She hadn't cheated, not yet, not physically, but her heart had already left the room. And I knew something then. I wasn't going to fight her for something she didn't want to protect. Over the next few weeks, I became quiet, but not passive. I smiled more. I supported her new lifestyle. When she began going out with her energy tribe, I encouraged it. I cooked dinner when she was late. I asked questions about her new books, her workshops. I listened when she spoke about tantric polarity and masculine surrender. All the while I was gathering my pieces. I met with a lawyer, quietly, discreetly. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand what a clean exit would look like. No drama, no courtroom battles. Just a clean severing of ties. I updated our finances, took inventory of shared accounts, realigned assets I'd brought into the marriage. I moved investments, rerouted paychecks, and restructured ownership of the house. Everything within my rights. She had no idea. At home, Lydia began to shift further away. She'd disappear on weekends to spiritual retreats in the woods or desert ceremonies. She began referring to me as her primary partner instead of her husband. She called it evolution. I called it erasure. I never judged her, not allowed. I believe people are allowed to change, to grow. But growth that demands the destruction of another person's dignity isn't growth. It's vanity dressed as virtue. One evening, she brought someone home. Not to introduce him, not formally, but I could feel it. He lingered too long in the doorway. She laughed too easily. Her eyes flicked toward mine like a dare. He was younger, barefoot, wearing beads and a woven poncho. He thanked me for my hospitality like I was the guest in my own home. That night, I didn't sleep, but I didn't crack either. Instead, I finalized my plans. I leased a quiet apartment across town under my name only. Simple, clean, and entirely mine. I gave my lawyer the green light. I wrote a letter, calm, detailed, firm. I explained that I was stepping away not out of anger, but because I respected myself too much to stay in a marriage where I was merely tolerated. On a Wednesday morning, while she was packing for another women's soul activation in Sedona, I made breakfast. I handed her a smoothie, kissed her on the forehead, and placed the letter on her pillow. By the time she returned, I was gone. The apartment was empty of my things. The accounts had been split. The divorce papers were already filed. And I had left a note on the kitchen counter, just 3 lines. I loved you. I believed in us. I'm letting you go to find whatever it is you're looking for. It wasn't revenge. It was a release. That first night alone in my new apartment, I didn't cry. I sat on the floor, ate takeout, and let the silence settle around me like a weighted blanket. It hurt, but it was clean. I wasn't broken. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And I had only just begun to rebuild, on my own terms. The first few days after I left, I expected the calls to come flooding in. Shouting, crying, accusations. But silence was all I got. Lydia didn't call, didn't text. Maybe she was trying to prove she didn't care. Maybe she didn't. That silence was louder than any argument we'd never had. The apartment was small, barely furnished, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The air didn't carry the weight of unspoken disappointments or strange incense. There were no echoes of awkward glances, no tension masked by soft voices and forced smiles. Just me, a worn-out couch, and the steady rhythm of a life finally my own. I got up early every morning, like always. Made coffee, read a book, took a walk. Those small rituals, things I had once shared with Lydia, became my own again. And I began to remember the man I used to be before I molded myself into someone who could keep her happy. I didn't blame her for changing. People grow. But the way she moved through our marriage like it was a costume she'd outgrown, that's what stung. She never said she was unhappy. She just decided one day that the life we'd built wasn't big enough for the version of herself she was chasing. And instead of inviting me along for the journey, she quietly began cutting the ropes that tied us together. I suppose she didn't expect me to cut the final one. 2 weeks after I left, I got a call. Not from Lydia, but from her sister, Marie. "She's shocked," Marie said. "She didn't think you'd actually leave. She thought you'd stick around, be the grounding presence while she explored, whatever this is." I didn't respond. What was there to say? "Are you okay?" Marie asked. "I'm free," I said. And it was true. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, but I wasn't going to pretend either. For years I had been the stable rock, the constant. While Lydia chased feelings and meanings, I held the line. And the more I think about it, the more I realize she didn't want a partner. She wanted a safety net. And when I pulled it away, she began to fall. That weekend, she showed up at my apartment. I heard the knock and knew it was her before I opened the door. She stood there holding a woven basket of fruit and herbs, some symbolic gesture she probably learned on her last retreat. "This is for grounding," she said, trying to smile. I stepped aside and let her in, not because I wanted to talk, but because I needed to hear what she'd say when the silence settled. "I didn't think you'd actually leave," she said, setting the basket down. "I know," I replied. She wandered the apartment like she was trying to find something to latch onto, but there was nothing here for her. No pictures of us, no shared memories. Just a single chair by the window and a dining table that hadn't hosted a conversation yet. "You look different," she said. "I feel different." She sat down. "You didn't even try to fight." "You made your choice," I said. "You decided what you needed. I just accepted it." "That's not weakness, Lydia. That's respect. For both of us." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. "I thought an open marriage would give us room to grow," she said. "I thought maybe we could rediscover each other along the way." "No," I said calmly. You thought I'd stay the same while you changed. You thought I'd wait. She lowered her gaze. Maybe I did. There was a long pause. I never stopped loving you, she added. I nodded. But you stopped choosing me. And that was the truth. Love without action is just sentiment, and I didn't have time to live in someone else's nostalgia. She left that evening with a quiet goodbye. No promises, no explanations. Just the dull realization that the door she had cracked open now closed behind her. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next chapter of my life was not one I had planned. I didn't suddenly find joy in solitude or reinvent myself overnight. But there was a steady sense of coming back home to myself. I went back to the things I had shelved over the years. I joined a weekend hiking group. I reconnected with my brother, who I hadn't seen in ages. I started taking photography classes at a local studio. The world didn't look brighter, but it looked clearer. A few months passed. I heard from mutual friends that Lydia had grown restless again. The people she'd built her new life around began to drift. One left for Thailand. Another started charging for sessions Lydia once called sacred. The connections weren't as pure as she'd hoped. Eventually, her world began to shrink. She called me again one evening, not to beg, just to talk. I miss our life, she said. I don't, I replied, not unkindly. There was a silence between us. This time, it wasn't heavy, it was honest. I didn't realize what I was losing, she said quietly. That's because you were only focused on what you thought you were gaining. I wasn't cruel. I didn't throw her choices in her face, but I didn't offer her a rope to climb back either. That part of our story was over. You see, I didn't burn bridges. I simply walked away from one and built a new one somewhere else. Lydia had chosen a path, one paved with shifting ideas and spiritual slogans. Maybe it had meaning. Maybe it didn't. But what it lacked was the one thing that makes love last. Commitment. The kind that stays steady even when the light dims. And I had no intention of spending the rest of my life being someone's anchor while they chased the wind. By the time the divorce finalized, I felt nothing but calm. I had my dignity, my peace, my life back. Lydia had her freedom, but freedom without foundation eventually turns to drift. As for me, I was just getting started. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was a different man. Not in the loud, visible ways people sometimes change, but in the quiet places, the thoughts I allowed myself to have, the boundaries I kept, the peace I no longer negotiated. I moved into a new apartment, not out of necessity, but because I wanted a space that had no ghosts. This one had wide windows, warm light, and a small balcony where I kept a few plants. I took my time decorating it, not for anyone else, just for me. Everything I chose had intention, from the books on the shelf to the scent of the candles I lit each evening. It was mine, and it was enough. Lydia reached out now and then. Nothing intense. A text here, a message there. Sometimes to ask how I was, sometimes to share a quote or a memory. I replied when I felt like it, kindly, briefly, without offering an opening she could slip through. She had made her bed with uncertainty. I hoped she was finding what she'd been chasing, but it wasn't my job to ask anymore. One afternoon, I ran into her at a local market. She was thinner than I remembered, dressed in flowing fabrics that looked more costume than clothing. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes gave her away. They were tired, searching. We exchanged pleasantries. She asked how I was. I told her the truth. I was well. She nodded and looked around like she couldn't decide what to say next. You look solid, she finally said. Centered. I am, I replied. There was a moment where I could see her trying to climb back through time, to find some version of us still living in the past. But I didn't reach across. I didn't invite her in. Not out of spite, but because that chapter had closed, and I had learned the value of not reopening wounds just because they've stopped bleeding. After we parted ways, I didn't dwell on it. I went home, made dinner, and watched the sun go down from my balcony. That was the life I had now, simple, steady, mine. I didn't jump into dating. I wasn't looking to fill a void. For the first time in years, I wasn't missing anything. I was full of clarity, of purpose, of self, and that feeling wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, but it echoed through everything I did. Around the 1 year mark after the divorce, I received a letter. Not an email, a real letter in Lydia's handwriting. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. It wasn't long, just a page. She wrote about the things she had learned, how some of the people who seemed so enlightened had turned out to be lost themselves. She admitted she had confused freedom with detachment, mistaking depth for novelty. She apologized, not just for what she did, but for how blind she had been to what we had. And she ended it with a line I won't forget. You were never holding me back. You were the only thing that kept me grounded. I didn't respond, not out of coldness, but because the man she was writing to no longer existed. I had mourned the version of myself that bent to keep her happy, that waited for love to return like it was a delayed train. That man had left quietly without a fight and never came back. Life moved on. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping teenagers with career prep and resume building. I remembered how much guidance I had lacked when I was young and how easy it was to drift without a direction. In helping them, I found a deeper part of myself, a version that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Just a man being useful, steady, present. Eventually, I met someone new. Her name was Claire. We met through a friend at a casual dinner. She was calm, thoughtful, nothing performative about her. The first time we talked, I remember thinking, not that she lit a fire in me, but that she made me feel calm in a way that didn't ask me to disappear. There was no urgency, no testing of limits. Just two people talking about books, travel, how we both liked the sound of rain on windows. It was the kind of connection that doesn't scream for attention. It simply stays. Over time, we built something together. Not rushed, not forced. There were no declarations of soul contracts or spiritual alignments, just mutual respect, laughter, and a shared sense of peace. And after everything I'd been through, I realized that's what I'd always wanted. Not intensity, not spectacle, just a place to rest, a person to rest with. Lydia remained a distant name, a closed chapter. Sometimes people ask me about her, about what happened. I don't offer much. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because the story is over and I don't need to keep telling it. I didn't win or lose. There was no revenge. There was no grand reveal or moment of humiliation. Just quiet choices, patient steps, and the slow, steady return to self. That's the thing people don't talk about when they speak of healing. It's not loud. It's not always triumphant. Sometimes it's just making breakfast in silence and being okay with it. Sometimes it's driving to work with no weight on your chest. Sometimes it's looking at the person you used to love and feeling nothing. Not hate, not yearning, just release. And that, I've found, is the loudest kind of freedom. I walked away with my integrity, my peace, and my future. She chased the wind. I built a home. And in the end, that was enough.